Mabel was 70 years old. Her life, once full of movement and caring for her family, has now turned into a quiet, measured existence. Since her husband passed away, the house has been empty. The children had grown up a long time ago. Everyone was busy with their own lives, and now they visited her only on holidays, coming with their families, children and grandchildren, filling her house with laughter and joy for a few short days, after which they returned to their worries. She understood that this was the natural course of things, but loneliness became her constant companion. Every morning Mabel woke up in her big bed, where she had once slept with her husband. Now she occupied one side of the bed, and the other was always untouched. The sun's rays penetrated through the thick curtains into her bedroom, illuminating the room with a soft light, but it did not bring her joy. The day began with the usual rituals: cooking breakfast, coffee and watching the news on TV. However, over time, these rituals became empty. They did not bring satisfaction. Her days, filled with silence and memories, resembled a long, slow stream that hardly changed. Mabel often recalled her youth and the times when the house was full of life. Previously, her house was a place where the whole family gathered. Children ran around the house. There were ringing voices and laughter. Mabel cooked dinners for a whole crowd, and it seemed like it would always be like this. But life turned out to be unpredictable. First, her husband left, then the children began to come less and less often, and over time, the neighbors began to fade into the background. Many of her friends have either moved away or passed away. Her phone rang less and less, and the house, once full of noisy conversations, was plunged into silence. She loved to walk around her quiet neighborhood. Small streets with green trees, familiar benches and parks became the only way for her to diversify her time. But even walking began to seem like something mechanical to her, something that she did only in order not to get stuck in four walls. Her heart was full of memories, but there was no joy in them. It was like watching an old movie that once caused tears and laughter, but now seems far away and has no power. One day, returning home from another walk, Mabel found herself thinking that she no longer wanted to return to an empty house. She walked slowly, as if hoping that someone would meet her on the doorstep, someone with whom she could share her thoughts and memories. But there was no such person. Mabel entered the house, closed the door behind her, and sank back into solitude. She often looked at old photographs. One of them showed her and her husband on their wedding day. Both are young, beautiful, full of hopes and plans for the future. Mabel was smiling in the photo, her eyes shining with happiness. She remembered how much she loved her husband and how they built their lives together. Now all that remains of those days are photographs and memories. Mabel sighed heavily and put the photo back on the shelf. She knew that it was impossible to live with memories, but she felt that her heart was still living in the past. She felt a void that she couldn't fill in any way. Her children were busy with their lives, and she needed to find a way to live in this new world where she was left alone. She was no longer the energetic woman she had been in her youth, but there was still a thirst for life, a need for intimacy and warmth in her soul. One day Mabel decided to spend the evening on the veranda of her house. It was her favorite part of the house where she could sit, enjoy the evening air and listen to the sounds of the street. Her old rocking chair swayed under her weight, making soft creaks. She looked at the passing cars, at the rare passers-by, and thoughtfully listened to the sounds of nature. Sometimes it seemed to her that life around her was going on without her, and that she had become just an observer of this passage of time. Mabel knew that many people at her age felt lonely, but that didn't make it any easier. Her children rarely called, preoccupied with their own worries, and the friends she used to communicate with gradually left. Her closest friend died a year ago, and since then Mabel has not been able to find a new company. She tried to go to church, but everything changed there too. The younger generation did not know her, and she felt like a stranger even in the place where she used to spend so much time. She began to think about how to change her life. It was hard for her to imagine that anything could change at her age. But Mabel's heart still wanted warmth and intimacy. She didn't know where it might come from, but she felt she had to be open to something new. Perhaps life had prepared some other surprise for her. One day, while leaving the store, Mabel noticed a homeless man sitting on a bench next to a bus stop. His clothes were worn and his gaze was lost. But there was something about his face that immediately caught her attention. He didn't look like the usual homeless people she'd seen before. There was something deep about him, something that made her slow down. She passed by, but she couldn't stop thinking about him. This man seemed to be as lost in life as she was. She didn't know why his image had sunk so deeply into her soul, but something inside her said she needed to know more about him. The next day, Mabel saw him again on the same bench. She decided to come over and offer him the food she had bought on the way home. The man was wary at first, but then accepted her offer. So began their first conversation, which marked the beginning of something more. Mabel couldn't explain why she was so attracted to this man. Perhaps in his loneliness she saw a reflection of her own. John, as she later learned his name, told her his story. He was once a successful man, but lost everything due to a series of failures and tragedies. Now he was living on the streets, trying to find his way in this new, inhospitable world for him. Mabel listened to him, and her heart ached with compassion. She knew what it meant to lose everything and be alone with herself. Their conversations became more and more frequent, and Mabel began to realize that John was not just homeless. He was a man with deep feelings who, like her, was looking for warmth and understanding. Gradually, a strong friendship developed between them. John began to visit Mabel often, first for a cup of tea, and then they began to spend more time together, talking about life, the past, and what lies ahead. For the first time in a long time, Mabel felt that her house was full of life again. Mabel, as always, went for an evening walk around her neighborhood. These walks became not just a habit for her, but a way to somehow escape from the monotony and loneliness that filled her days. She loved the silence of her quiet neighborhood, the coolness of the evening air, and the rustle of leaves underfoot. This small piece of time was the only time she could leave the house and feel at least a little alive. Loneliness weighed on her, and every day became more and more like the previous one. One evening, when Mabel was returning from a walk, she noticed a man sitting at the bus stop. This was unusual. Usually at this time the stop was empty, because buses ran less frequently and evening passengers had already gone home. He was sitting with his head down on a bench, dressed in old, worn clothes. His face was hidden under a hat, and his hands lay helplessly on his lap. It seemed that the man had completely given himself up to fatigue and despair. Mabel slowed her pace. Something about this man caught her attention. Maybe it was his appearance, so haggard and lost, maybe something else. She couldn't tell for sure. But as she passed by, she felt a pang of pity and a strange kinship. This man looked as lonely as she had felt in recent years, but she decided to go on without stopping, even though her thought of him was still in her head. The next day, Mabel saw him again at the same bus stop. Now she couldn't get past it.
"Excuse me, sir. This is your second day here. Are you all right?"
Her voice was soft, but with a hint of concern. The man slowly raised his head. His face was tired, his eyes seemed empty, as if the world had long lost all meaning for him. He just stared at her for a few seconds before answering.
"It's all right, madam. Thank you for your concern."
His voice was low and hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken to people in a long time. Mabel felt that it was hard for him to just keep up the conversation.
"You look good. Tired. Maybe you need help? I have food at home. I live nearby. You can come to dinner."
The man paused, considering her offer. He is not used to having someone offer him help, especially strangers. The situation was awkward, and he didn't want to burden her, but his stomach had been rumbling with hunger for a long time.
"I don't want to bother you, madam. I'm used to coping on my own."
Mabel smiled slightly. She could see the pride in his eyes even in his plight. But she also understood that sometimes people in difficult situations need help, even if they are not ready to accept it.
It won't be a burden to me. I would be pleased if you would accompany me. The house is not far away and I just have some good food left. I think you'll like it.
John looked at her again. This time his gaze was more attentive. He saw a woman in front of him, not young, but with some inner light, and her offer seemed sincere. In the end, he realized that it would be almost rude to refuse her.
Well, if you insist. Thank you, I will accept your invitation.
Mabel smiled and motioned for him to follow her. They walked slowly towards her house, and Mabel felt relieved that she hadn't left him just like that. It was an opportunity not only for him, but also for her to feel some kind of connection with another person. When they reached her house, Mabel led John through the garden, into which she had once put so much love and work. Although it was a little abandoned, the flowers and shrubs were still pleasing to the eye. Her house was small, cozy, with warm shades, and John noticed that it felt cared for in every corner.
Have a seat in the kitchen. I'll cook something now.
John sat down awkwardly at the table, looking around. It was uncomfortable for him to be in such a place after all the years he had spent on the street, but he felt that Mabel was not judging him. He just didn't know how to react to her kindness. Mabel began to cook dinner, feeling something wake up in her soul that had not been there for a long time. It was nice for her to take care of someone again, to cook for someone other than herself. She took several dishes out of the refrigerator, warmed up the soup, and put a piece of fresh bread on the table. She did all this in silence, but a feeling of comfort and warmth filled the room. When the food was ready, Mabel served everything on the table and sat down opposite John.
Eat well. I'm glad you came.
John slowly picked up the spoon, still feeling awkward about the situation. He wasn't sure how to thank her for this simple, but so important concern for him.
Thank you, madam. That's very kind of you.
Mabel smiled.
Call me Mabel. We're neighbors, even though we haven't met before.
John nodded, accepting her words. He felt that this dinner was more than just a meal. It was a gesture of human kindness that he missed so much. They didn't talk much during dinner, but the atmosphere was warm. Mabel found out that his name was John, that he had once been a successful man, but had lost everything after a series of setbacks and tragedies. He lost his home, his job, his friends. But most of all, he was broken by the loss of his family. He spoke softly and reluctantly, as if every word was difficult for him. But Mabel listened attentively, without interrupting. She could see how hard it was for him to remember this, but she felt that he needed to be heard. When dinner was over, John pushed his plate away and looked at Mabel with gratitude in his eyes.
Thank you, Mabel. It's more than just food. I haven't seen such kindness in a long time.
Mabel smiled.
The world is full of good people, John. Sometimes you just need to open your eyes and see them. And sometimes you can offer a helping hand yourself.
These words stung John. He felt that her kindness was not accidental. She, like him, knew what it meant to lose someone and be alone. After that dinner, their meetings became regular. John came to Mabel's whenever he could, and she was always glad to see him. Gradually, they began to share their stories, finding more and more common in their experiences. Mabel felt her house filling up with warmth again, and John found in her the support he had long lost. And although they both understood that their lives had developed differently, their bond was getting stronger. Mabel saw in John not just a homeless man, but a man with a rich inner world who needed a new opportunity. And John began to realize that there could still be a place for warmth and friendship in his life. After their first meeting at the bus stop, Mabel couldn't stop thinking about John. His story, the short snippets of words he uttered at dinner, touched her to the core. She saw in front of her not just a homeless man who had lost everything, but also a man with a deep wound who lived with the consequences of his failures and losses. There was sadness and despair in his eyes, a familiar feeling of loneliness, and Mabel felt that she could be a support for him. Mabel decided to continue her attempts to help John. She often brought him food to the bus stop, where he spent his days, or invited him to her house for dinner. Gradually, these meetings became regular, and she began to get to know him better. They talked about everything about life, the past, the losses that each of them had experienced. In each conversation, Mabel became more and more aware that John was not just a person in a difficult situation, but someone with whom she felt an unusual connection. John, who was initially wary and closed, gradually began to open up. He told Mabel his story slowly, sometimes stopping to catch his breath, as if the memories were a heavy burden for him. He was once a successful man, worked for a construction company, and had a family. But then everything went wrong. The financial crisis led to job loss, followed by personal tragedies, divorce, and the death of a close friend. These events left John without support and without the desire to continue fighting. He found himself on the street, having lost faith in himself and in the future. Mabel listened to him with attention and sympathy. She understood that even the strongest people can find themselves in a difficult situation, that life can be cruel and unpredictable. Every day her respect for John grew. She saw that behind his outward fatigue and shabby appearance there was a man with a kind heart and wisdom that could not always be immediately noticed. His speech, though sometimes a little confusing, was filled with observations about life, reflections that struck her with depth. John was grateful to Mabel for her support. He knew that in his position it was rare to count on human warmth and care. People usually turned away, not wanting to deal with someone who was on the sidelines of life. But Mabel was different. She not only fed him, but also listened to him like no one had done before. Every time she brought him something to eat or invited him to her house for dinner, he felt how her kindness softened his harsh everyday life. She filled his life with meaning, even if it was just a short dinner at the kitchen table. Their conversations became a source of comfort for both of them. Mabel told John about her past, about her life with her husband, about the children who now lived far away and rarely communicated with her. She talked about her dreams, which already seemed far away, about how she missed human warmth. John understood her pain. They both knew what loneliness was, each in their own way, but together it became a little easier for them. Over time, Mabel began to feel that her house, which had been empty and cold for so long, was being filled with new energy. Her everyday life has stopped being monotonous. She felt the joy of being able to take care of someone again. At the same time, John began to believe that his life could change. Despite all the difficulties, he saw a light in Mabel's eyes that gave him hope. Their friendship grew stronger every day. John often helped Mabel around the house. He repaired old things that had long needed attention, tended the garden. He was pleased to feel that he could be useful again, and not just exist on the street. It gave him a purpose and made him look at life from a different angle. One day, when the autumn rains hit the city, Mabel thought uneasily about John, who was still spending nights outside. She knew that it was unbearable to live outside in such weather. Her anxiety for him grew every day. And one evening, when it was raining like a bucket, Mabel decided to invite John to spend the night with her. It was not just a gesture of hospitality, but an act of sincere care. She could not imagine that a man whom she had already begun to consider a friend would get wet and freeze on the street. When she invited him to stay the night, John hesitated at first. He was not used to accepting help, especially of this kind. It seemed wrong to burden her with his presence, but seeing her sincere concern, he could not refuse. It was the first time in a long time that he had spent the night in warmth, under a roof, and not outside, and the feeling of gratitude he felt was enormous. They talked for a long time that night. John told Mabel more about his life, how he lost everything, and how it changed his view of the world. He talked about his dreams, which now seemed so far away and unattainable. Mabel, in turn, shared her experiences, talking about how her life changed after her husband's death. These conversations brought them even closer together. Each of them found solace in being able to share their thoughts and experiences with another person. John began to stay at Mabel's more often, especially on days when the weather became too harsh. He helped her around the house, sometimes just sat on the veranda, enjoying the warmth of her company. Mabel felt that her house was no longer empty. She enjoyed every day she spent with John. Her life had found meaning again. And although she understood that their friendship could cause condemnation from neighbors or even relatives, she didn't care. John, in turn, was beginning to feel that he had a chance at a new life. Mabel not only provided him with a roof over his head and food, but also gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging. They became real friends, and John began to think about how he could change his life thanks to her support. Their friendship gradually grew into something more. Mabel saw in John a person with whom she could share her days, and John began to see in her not just a kind woman, but someone who restored his faith in himself. There was a feeling of mutual care and affection in their communication, which was much deeper than just friendship. Over time, as Mabel and John began to spend more and more time together, their friendship slowly but inevitably began to turn into something more. With each day spent talking, dining together, and doing housework, they developed a special intimacy that went beyond simple friendship. At first, Mabel and John saw it as caring for each other, as support in difficult times, but over time they began to realize that their feelings had become much deeper. Mabel, who had been living alone for a long time, began to notice that her days were filled with meaning and joy again. John's presence in her home not only refreshed her daily life, but also gave her a sense of belonging. She felt alive, needed, and loved again. John brought not only physical help to her house when he repaired minor breakdowns or tended the garden, but also emotional warmth that she had long lost. He was attentive to her, listened to her, supported her, and even anticipated her desires, as if they were connected by some invisible knot. Every morning, when Mabel woke up, her first thought was that she would see John again today. He became an integral part of her life. They walked together through her garden, which has now begun to flourish again, thanks to John's care. He brought a sense of order and comfort to the house that Mabel had long lost. They cooked together, sat down at the table, and discussed everything that came to mind, from memories of their youth to their current dreams and plans for the future, even if that future seemed uncertain. John, who was used to loneliness and the difficulties of living on the street, also began to experience changes in his inner state. Mabel's presence restored his confidence and dignity. He no longer felt like an outcast from society, forgotten and unnecessary. In her eyes, he was a valuable person, and this changed his perception of himself. Her kindness and tenderness helped him forget about the bitterness of the past years. He began to look at life with new hope, and although his situation still left much to be desired, something bright was emerging in his heart. Gradually, John began to show signs of attention to Mabel, which went much deeper than simple gratitude for her help. He began to take care of her with special tenderness, bringing her flowers that he found in the park, or making small surprises. In the evenings, he often sat with her on the veranda, listening to her talk about her youth, about the days when her house was full of people. He saw her eyes light up at the memory, and felt that he wanted to be a part of her new future, to help her find the happiness she had once lost. Mabel, in turn, began to notice that her feelings for John were also changing. What began as a desire to help a person in need has now become much more personal and profound. She realized that she was attracted to John not only because of his story and need for support, but also because he filled the void she had felt for so long after losing her husband. His presence gave her a sense of warmth and protection that she had lacked for many years. She began to think that their friendship could turn into something more than just a relationship between two people who were helped by life circumstances. With each passing day, their closeness became more and more palpable. They could talk for hours, sitting at a table on the veranda, or just be silent, enjoying each other's company. Their silence was not painful, on the contrary, it was filled with understanding and trust. John began to touch Mabel's hand a little longer than necessary, and she in turn did not pull away, feeling her heart come alive again. These small gestures, which at first seemed insignificant, gradually became a symbol of their new, developing bond. Mabel couldn't imagine her life without John anymore. She began to realize that her feelings for him were not just sympathy, but real affection. John was kind, considerate, and although his position in society was far from ideal, it didn't matter to her. She was drawn to him not because he needed help, but because he had become something important and irreplaceable to her. John, despite his position, felt responsible for Mabel. He knew he couldn't offer her luxury or wealth, but he could offer her his care, dedication, and support. He began to see in their relationship not only a chance for personal salvation, but also an opportunity to give Mabel the love she deserved. Every day spent with her gave him the strength and motivation to fight for a better future, not only for himself, but also for her. There came a moment when both realized that their feelings had outgrown friendship. One quiet evening, as they sat on the veranda, listening to the evening wind rustle the leaves of the trees, John looked at Mabel with such tenderness and attention that she realized he felt it too. At that moment, their connection became undeniable. John took her hand, and Mabel felt her heart beat faster. She realized that this feeling was no longer just friendship, but something much deeper and stronger. Now they both knew that they had romantic feelings for each other, but they were in no hurry to talk about it out loud. Their relationship developed naturally, without haste. Each new touch, each look only strengthened their affection for each other. Mabel was no longer afraid of condemnation or possible consequences. She felt happy with John and understood that life had given her a second chance at love, despite her age and circumstances. John, for his part, also realized that Mabel had become more than just a friend or a kind woman who offered to help him. She became the person for whom he wanted to become a better person, to return to a normal life. Her love and support inspired him to put his past behind him and start a new chapter. And although there were many difficulties ahead of them, they both knew that together they could cope with any challenges. Their bond became a source of strength and hope for both of them, and now they could move forward knowing that there was someone they could rely on. When the romance between Mabel and John began to develop, at first everything seemed natural and simple. Their days together were full of warmth and understanding, and they enjoyed each other without question. But soon this idyll was disrupted by external factors. People in the small neighborhood where Mabel lived began to notice that John began to visit her more often. Neighbors who had known Mabel for many years noticed that her house was no longer so quiet and secluded. Instead, it had a lively atmosphere, and John was often seen at her door. At first, this aroused curiosity, but soon the curiosity turned into discussions. Mabel had lived in the area all her life, and many of her neighbors felt that they knew her and had the right to discuss her life. They noticed how John, the man they knew as homeless, began to spend more and more time with her and began to wonder what was really going on between them. No one dared to ask Mabel a direct question, but there were whispers and speculation behind her back. Some of the neighbors, especially those who had known Mabel for a long time, began to feel worried about her. In their eyes, she was a respected widow, a mother who raised children, and was an example of decency all her life. They couldn't understand how she could get in touch with a man who had once lost everything, ended up on the street, and was unknown to anyone. In the eyes of these people, John was just homeless, and they saw nothing in him but a threat to Mabel and her reputation. The neighbors began to discuss this among themselves, and soon their conversations became more violent. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Henderson, who was in charge of the house and always kept order in the area, could not hide her indignation. She believed that Mabel was making a mistake by letting a man from the street into her house, and decided that it was her duty to intervene. One day, Mrs. Henderson approached Mabel as she was returning home from a walk with John. Mrs. Henderson made no secret of her disapproval. She began by solicitously asking Mabel if she was okay, but her words quickly turned into harsh criticism. She hinted that John was most likely using Mabel, that his only purpose was to profit at her expense. Mrs. Henderson talked about people discussing their relationship and that she should be careful. This conversation left Mabel confused. She understood that her neighbor was trying to show concern, but her words hurt deeply. Mabel knew that John was not what he was supposed to be. She saw in him a man who was kind, attentive, and honest. But Mrs. Henderson's doubts began to gnaw at her soul. Over time, other neighbors began to approach Mabel with advice. Each of them seemed to know what was best for her. Someone advised her to stay away from John, saying that people might misinterpret her behavior. Some even expressed concern for her safety, hinting that John could be a dangerous person. All these conversations began to accumulate in Mabel's head, creating an internal conflict. Mabel found herself at a crossroads. On the one hand, she sincerely loved John and knew that he would never do anything wrong to her. He was a real source of joy for her, a man who gave her back a sense of life and meaning. But on the other hand, the condemnation of society, which had always been important to her, was beginning to weigh on her. She was not a young woman, and the reputation she had built all her life could be destroyed in a matter of months. She has always been respected for the way she led her life, how she took care of her family, and how she lived all these years after her husband's death. Her friends also started to worry. They tried to warn her against communicating with John, believing that he could hurt her, even if he did not realize it himself. They talked about how she deserved something better, that she should find a more worthy partner who would match her level. Her friend Evelyn, with whom Mabel had been friends for more than 20 years, was especially persistent. She told Mabel that John would not be able to give her the life she deserved, and that she should think about her family, about her children, who might be against such a relationship. These words began to worry Mabel. She really started to think about how her children would react to her relationship with John. Her son and daughter had been living far away for a long time, and they did not know about her new friend. Mabel was worried that they might not understand her choice. She knew that her children had always been proud of the way she dealt with life's difficulties, and now she was afraid that they might consider her decision to be wrong. The internal conflict grew. Mabel faced doubts every day. Her love for John was real, but she couldn't ignore the pressure from others. The society she lived in dictated its own rules, and it was difficult for her to just throw them away. She began to doubt herself, to ask questions. Is she really making the right choice? Perhaps her neighbors and friends are right, and she got too carried away with this new love, not noticing all the pitfalls. In the evenings when she and John sat together, she often found herself thinking that she could not completely relax. Doubts were eating at her from the inside, and she tried to hide them from John. She knew he knew something was wrong, but she didn't want to burden him with her worries. However, these thoughts became more and more intrusive. John also began to notice that people looked at him differently. He felt that his presence in Mabel's life was being judged, and it hurt him. He didn't want to be the cause of her problems, but he also couldn't leave knowing that their relationship had become something important to both of them. Mabel was faced with a choice: follow her heart and continue her relationship with John, despite the condemnation of society, or succumb to pressure and stop everything in order to preserve her reputation and peace of mind. This choice was a real test for her. She tried to find a balance between love and social norms, but every day this balance seemed more and more unattainable. Mabel thought for a long time about what her neighbors and friends had told her. Their doubts and warnings slowly but surely penetrated her thoughts, poisoning the joy she felt from communicating with John. Her soul was at a crossroads. On the one hand, she felt a real closeness with John that she hadn't felt in a long time. he gave her back a taste for life, and her days were filled with meaning and warmth again. On the other hand, there was public opinion, ingrained norms and rules that she tried to follow all her life. The expectations of others, sometimes imposed, stood in front of her like an impenetrable wall. Her friend Evelyn, neighbors, and even random people on the street began to look askance in her direction. Mabel saw it all, heard them whispering behind her back. More than once she woke up in the middle of the night, pondering her situation. She was tormented by thoughts of what the children would say when they found out that their mother had started a new relationship. She felt responsible to them, as well as to her husband's memory. The years of marriage she had spent with him had been happy, and although he had been gone for a long time, the memories of him remained vivid. Reflecting, she constantly tried to figure out, is she doing the right thing by opening her heart to a new person? Is she betraying her past in this way? But John was completely different. He was not a part of her past, was not connected with the foundations in which she had lived for so many years. He was a man who had lost everything, and was at the very bottom of society, but even then he did not lose his humanity and dignity. His experiences, his losses, all this Mabel saw, understood and accepted. She saw in him a man who, despite the difficulties, retained inner light, hope, albeit hidden deep inside. That was what drew her to him. John wasn't looking for pity or asking for anything in return. He was just there for her, was the one who shared her loneliness and filled the void in her heart. One day, after another meeting with a neighbor who was not shy about expressing her opinion about John and her attitude towards him, Mabel returned home and sat down in an armchair. She stared out the window at her garden for a long time, which John helped her keep in order, and wondered what love meant. She was 70 years old. At her age, she already thought that her life had been reduced to memories of the past, that no joys of the future awaited her anymore. However, despite the years, she was still alive. The fire was still burning inside her, and it was John who helped her feel it again. She realized that life is not limited by the limits that society exposes. Ultimately, everyone deserves happiness and love, regardless of age and circumstances. And if John has become the source of this happiness for her, then she should not give up on him for fear of being judged by others. From that moment on, the decision began to take shape in her head. Mabel decided that she would no longer let other people's opinions determine her life. For the first time in many years, she felt real freedom in her choice. She knew it wasn't going to be an easy path, but she was ready to take it. She could no longer ignore what her heart told her John was an important part of her life, and she was ready to fight for their future together. The next day, Mabel met with John, and as always, they spent time together walking around her garden and talking about life. John, as usual, was reserved, but she saw gratitude and affection in his eyes. He became for her not only a friend, but also a reliable companion, a man who understood her without words. In their silent communication, there was that very simple truth that you would not notice in your youth. Sometimes true love does not consist in loud words, but in quiet, everyday moments when someone next to you just holds your hand. When the evening came to an end, Mabel made a decision that had been maturing in her soul for a long time. She suggested that John start looking for a job. It was not an easy offer, because John had been living on the street for a long time and had already lost faith that he could have a new beginning. But Mabel saw potential in him, a man who could change his life if only someone believed in him. Her faith was what could push John into action. John was skeptical at first. He doubted that he would be able to find a job because his past, as he believed, closed all doors to him. But Mabel didn't back down. She insisted that his experience and skills could be useful, that she was ready to support him along the way. In her eyes, he was not just a homeless man, but a man with a deep inner world who deserved a second chance. They started small. John found a part-time job at a local store, where he was entrusted with small assignments. It wasn't something he was used to in his previous life, but it was an important step forward for him. Every day he became more and more convinced that he could return to a normal life. Thanks to Mabel's support, his confidence grew. He was no longer the lost man she had met at the bus stop. John was starting to believe in himself and his powers again. A few months passed, and John was able to find a permanent job at the construction company where he once worked before he lost everything. It was not easy to restore his reputation, but his experience and skills helped him return to the profession. Working every day, he felt like his life was being filled with meaning again, like he was becoming a part of society again. At the same time, the relationship with Mabel was getting stronger. Despite the condemnation of some neighbors, Mabel was no longer shy about her feelings. Her house, which had once been empty and cold, was now alive again. She and John did gardening together, cooked dinners, and enjoyed each other's company. In these simple daily activities, they found what they had been looking for so long: peace, support, and love. The story of their relationship soon became known to many. People who once condemned Mabel for her choice began to see in their couple something more than just a connection between an elderly woman and a homeless man. They saw that love can come at any age, in any circumstances. The neighbors, who used to whisper behind their backs, now began to treat them with respect. They saw how John changed his life, how he became an important part of Mabel's life, and gradually their attitude towards the couple began to change. Even Mabel's children, upon learning about John, were wary at first, but when they saw how happy their mother was, they accepted her choice. They realized that Mabel deserved to be happy, and that John, despite his past, had become a reliable support for her. Mabel and John continued to build their lives together. They did not seek luxury or fame. Their happiness was in simple things: walking together, talking over a cup of tea, working in the garden. But most importantly, they found in each other what they had been looking for all their lives: real, sincere love. This story has become an example of how it's never too late to start all over again, that age is not an obstacle to love, and that everyone, regardless of their past, deserves a second chance. Mabel and John proved that happiness can come even when you least expect it, and that love can really be stronger than public opinion and prejudice. After all, they lived their days together, enjoying every moment. Their life was far from ideal, but they found in it what they were looking for: peace, love, and mutual respect. And that was the most important thing.